Okay, it's time to get to the good stuff, which is the rendering or modeling of the form. And we're going to be using black and white charcoal pencils to do that. And let me show you what we'll be using here. So the materials that you'll need to have prepared. I've got a black charcoal pencil here. I'm using a Wolf's Carbon. This is a 4B, and you can see just a small piece of it left held in my charcoal holder. And sharpened to a really elongated point with razor blades and sanded on a sanding block to create that elongated point. So I've got one in 4B. I've also got one in just a regular B. So Wolf's Carbon charcoal pencil. I also have here a Carb Othello white chalk pastel pencil, and that's a number 100 is the code there. It's hard to read that, but it says 100. Carb Othello, made by Stabilo, and you can see it's been sharpened with razor blades and sanded on the sanding block. Really important for us here are smaller blending tools. So these are my little bristle brushes that I use for blending. Notice I've got two now, and I've got one that I'm going to reserve for blending black charcoal, and then one that I'm going to reserve for blending the white chalk, keeping them separate. Also, some of the materials that we've seen before, vine charcoal and a charcoal holder, just in case we want to go back to that, and a kneaded eraser pinched into whatever shape you need it to be. All right, so to start rendering, we're going to pick what our form goal is to start with. And that could be anything you decide on. But a wise choice is something that has a full value range in it. So, for example, the nose could be a great choice because it has the brightest highlight in it on the nose. And it also has really dark shadows. And it's also a very sculptural form that erupts off of the face, and we can really start to turn that and get a sense of volume and form. Another good choice might be the eye here, it's also a good choice because it does have a fully comprehensive value range from one of the brightest brights to the darkest darks. And it's also psychologically rewarding to complete an eye as a way of starting off. It's also wise to start with something in the middle of the drawing. So an eye, a nose, the other eye. That way, if we make corrections to shape as we go along, we can kind of push our edits out to the outer regions as we move along. Now, before we get going any further, let's take a moment to identify the hierarchy of the lights in this portrait of John. Where do we see the brightest thing? So the brightest thing in the whole portrait is going to be the highlight on the nose. That's number one. What would be second place? The second place brightest thing will be this piece of light on the mask of his face. And maybe either tied with or a third place going to the highlight on the forehead up here. And fourth place, probably the highlight in the eye here and here. So it's good to know that as we go forward, that as we encounter highlights here and here, or just not even highlights, but brighter lights, and highlights in the lips, brightness in the beard and mustache, we can put them in their proper place in terms of the value. And a common thing to do would be to make this moment over here, this bright light, to make a mistake where we make that as bright as maybe our brightest highlight. That's the kind of error that often gets made. So by taking this moment to establish what the hierarchy of the lights is, we have a more successful outcome to any subsequent rendering that's about to happen. All right, starting off, I'm going to use the B, and I'm going to go right into my decision to render the eye on the light side here. This is kind of an unclear relationship between which one is the active eye and which one is the passive eye. We might say this could be the active eye because it's closer, but it's more heavily obscured by shadow. This eye is a little further away, but it is more illuminated and more open to the viewer, and so perhaps that could be the active eye. So it's really unclear in this portrait which is an active eye and which is a passive eye. There doesn't always need to be a clear distinction. So that you can see the first things I'm going for here are slowly turning up the value, the darkness on the eyelash above. Let's keep this pencil nice and sharp. Even though it looked sharp, it's not feeling sharp to me, so I'm taking a moment to sharpen up here. Put a real point on there. And I'm adding a little bit of deepening of value to the suprapalpebral crease. So we're setting the stage here for one of the best parts of this process is when we get to finally drop in the white chalk. That's always fun and rewarding, and it really seems to come to life in that moment and pop off the page. Now, I do want to add a disclaimer that I always try to talk about when I do these video demos, which is that what I'm seeing on the camera, which you're seeing, is a good step darker than what I'm actually doing. So the black that I put in the iris and the crease above the eye, it looks severely black in the video. I can see on the screen. But it's just not quite that dark in my actual drawing. And the other thing that you'll see as we go forward is that the contrast will be a little heavier in the video than what is true to the actual drawing. So that means the intensity of the differences between light and dark is going to be a little bit more intense than what's really going on the actual drawing. But it's just a little casualty of the format that we're restricted to here. So notice it's still a time where we could make revisions and correction to shape, and it often is a moment where we discover edits to shape that need to happen, because in the act of rendering we're adding more finesse to our shapes, more finesse to the value relationships. We're adding darks. We're finding edges of things that maybe weren't found before. We're blending and polishing things. And so it's only natural that we may discover that something might not quite be in the right place or might not quite be the right shape. And go ahead and try to correct it if you can. If you can make a correction without really upheaving the drawing, without making a huge destructive procedure, a destructive pass where you're erasing everything and changing everything, that's not a good thing to do. But if you find a way that you can achieve the change, the edit to the shape or the location, go ahead and do it. It's always a good time. It's always a good move to improve the shapes and the placement if you discover an edit that needs to happen. Here you can see I'm rendering a core shadow along this shadow shape, which falls inside the brow ridge and falls partially inside the eyebrow itself. So this darker strip along the top is actually a core shadow. And on the opposite side of that same shadow shape, we're actually seeing a cast shadow edge. So this is a really great workout for looking and analyzing shadow shapes, looking at and analyzing shadow shapes. So this is a shadow shape. We see that the leading edge of it, the lightward edge of it, the top, is going to be a form shadow edge. Therefore, we will see a core shadow. We'll see some reflected light filling in the middle of the shadow shape, and then the lower edge is actually this form projecting itself in shadow onto this form. So we see a sharper edge, and we get a cast shadow. Now, once we go to this terminator, we are back into a form shadow again. So as you render your shadow shapes, always be in the spirit of investigating and decoding what you're looking at. You know, shadow shape edges. Am I looking at a form shadow edge here? or a cast shadow edge here? Am I looking at a form shadow edge here or a cast shadow edge here? So try to answer that. Is this a form shadow or a cast shadow edge? And is this a form shadow or a cast shadow edge? So if you said this was a form shadow edge, you were correct. And if you said this is a cast shadow edge, you were correct. Okay, let's get ready to put in some of the white chalk. Now, here's a rule that you have to live by when you render with black and white charcoal on toned paper. You cannot mix the white chalk with the charcoal. It creates a really unattractive color when you do so. Makes a smoky blue appearance, and it doesn't seem to harmonize with the rest of the drawing. It usually creates a condition where once you start mixing the white chalk and the black charcoal together, you kind of have to do it everywhere. And so we want to think about the philosophy of what we have going on here. Realize that we have black charcoal assigned to all the darker values. We're going to have white chalk assigned to all of the brighter values. The paper value is already a value on the value scale. And so we realize that any place where we feel like we want to mix the black and the white chalks together, we should just let the paper be the operative element in that moment. Now notice I'm using my kneaded eraser to do a couple things, accomplish a couple things all at once here. One is I'm lifting out any residual presence of the vine charcoal which was there before, and I'm also using it to try to shape the correction that I wanted to have happen there. I just realized I wanted to move this shadow up a little bit, so I'm subtractively scooting it up. It's amazing how as soon as you hit the moment where you realize you're going to start working with that shape as your goal, you suddenly see the shapes more accurately than you did before. And that's why it's important to always be considering all the shapes, whether they're shadow shapes or whether they're light shapes. So sometimes we have to tell our brain to sort of reverse the polarity of what it's looking at and what it's seeing. Tell your brain, stop seeing the shadow shapes here and start seeing the light shapes as the thing that you're measuring and gauging. So you're talking to your brain when you're saying that. And your brain will say, oh, okay, you mean look at this shape, look at this puzzle piece. And that's when you might detect an edit. All right, so without further ado, we're going to place white chalk in the drawing. And I see that needs to be here on the eyelid for our first introduction of white chalk, and here on the just the underbrow form. And so I'm going to hatch in the white chalk. It is not showing up that well in this lighting on the camera. Well, you can see it there. Okay, good. Sometimes the lights in my studio at night, they kind of can almost negate the white chalk for some reason at certain angles to the light. But we're good here. So there's the white chalk. Let's have fun here. We're going to do a little sparkle of white fluid in the eye on the lower eyelid, creating a little highlight there. It's very lovely. And then John has the rim of the lower eyelid here is catching a highlight, a very thin linear highlight. So I'm just going to draw that right on. And I am cutting right through that the black charcoal, sort of overriding it. So that's different than mixing it. I'm kind of overriding it a little bit. It's helping me to find the location of of the lower eyelid a little bit more, maybe feeling like it needs to come a little lower now that I have all these elements in play. And notice the darker value here of this eyelid. It wants to ultimately merge back into the dark values inside the opening of the eye. So as you render this form, keep in mind that we want everything connected. We don't want to fragment. Now look at, here is the brush coming in for the first time. I've got the black charcoal blending brush, and I'm just gonna basically use the brush as it's meant to be used in a painting motion. And I'm thinking about blending that black charcoal pencil, integrating it with the vine charcoal, which is already there, smoothing it out a little bit. And sometimes you can achieve a couple of critical moves in rendering with it by actually using the residue of black chalk on the brush to maybe draw with a little bit or create a transition or fill in a value that's missing, like I'm doing right now. So the brush can be a really big helping hand. So I'm pulling that charcoal this way to create that crease and that plane in the forehead. And you see, we go real slow, and with a really highly cultivated sense of patience, and the slowness speaks for itself, because if you can keep up this pace of slow rendering, slow analysis, appreciating each form, each subform to the fullest extent, then you win big results, and you have successful effects happening in the piece, and that really bolsters your morale to maintain that pace, keep it up, and to go one form at a time. Notice I just used the kneaded eraser to prepare the paper for the addition of white chalk here on the bag of the eye. So remember, that's an important habit to get into, is always prepare the paper. If you're going to be adding white chalk into an area, you don't want to add it into an area where there's a lot of charcoal residue. Otherwise, you'll see kind of a smoky blue, unattractive haze take place in a mixture between the chalk and the charcoal. And the very delicate values here on the bag of the eye, I'm going to try to just render those with just the brush alone, and the fact that the brush is sort of loaded with some charcoal residue that's already there. I'm just going to go ahead and use the residue on the brush to try to achieve that value. But not to mix it with the white chalk. So there's actually, it's hard to tell from the video, but I'll point it out. If you were to look close, you would see that there's a little interim zone right there, and even very tightly through here, where it's the paper. It's the paper showing through. Now, if you were to slam the white chalk together with the black chalk, it should be only in moments where a crease is cutting through the form like that, or where perhaps a cast shadow cuts across a brightly illuminated area. Like probably when we get to here, we're going to have a cast shadow cutting across the brightly illuminated mustache, which is gray, white. We'll be using some white chalk there, and here we have the black chalk immediately adjacent to it. So those are the only moments where you should be using black right up against white chalk. It's either a crease or it's a cast shadow slicing across a brightly illuminated form. But if you were to bring the white chalk right up to the terminator of a round form, like here or here or here, you're going to create the illusion of a corner on a box. So it's going to be a sharp rectilinear corner in a place where we don't want that to happen. So you need to use the paper as a turning value. And I know from experience that I can demonstrate that now, and I can say it verbally to you, but when you get into your own drawing, many of you or most of you will still do that. And of course, that's why I'm here. I'm going to chime in at that point and say, you're colliding your white chalk up against your black charcoal and it's creating a corner. So that's why we do this, so we can have that dialogue and that guidance. All right, let's carry it out a little further. As I start to move away from the eye, I'm going to prepare the next area. I make a decision now, a conscious decision about where my next form goal is. And I decide that I'm going to sneak my way over to the nose, but before I do that, I want to render the light on the mask of the face here. So I'm going to start to prepare the way to do that. And so as I prepare the way, I look ahead to see where am I going to be using white chalk, and is there any charcoal residue in the way? And because I've been brushing the drawing so many times from the previous demos, I use this big brush and I brush it over and over and over, that a lot of these areas actually have a pretty fairly conspicuous buildup of vine charcoal residue. But it's fun to see how easily that lifts off. So you can see the contrast there. That's just back to the pure paper now, right in the tear duct there. Now it's a good moment, I suppose, as good as any, to demonstrate something that I feel like I need to do. In order to really render that, I want to rest my hand on the drawing, but I shouldn't because of all the charcoal here. And so resist the temptation to rest your hand on your drawing when you want to render. And yet we want to really control this lifting out here to really create that light that wraps around the bag of the eye. So I'm going to get from behind my easel here what is called a maul stick. A maul stick you've probably seen in old master paintings. It's a long stick or kind of a staff with a leather wrapped ball, a hide wrapped ball at the end of it. You can see it's really long. It's about 3 feet long. And what we do is we hold it in our non-drawing hand. So I'm going to be holding it not in my right hand, but I'm going to hold it with my left hand. And it's going to cut across the drawing. So here's the wrapped end. I'm going to send this over all the way to the right side of the drawing board and rest it on the right side of the drawing board. And what I can now do is I can hold it in position so it's not touching the drawing, and I can rest my drawing hand on this stick. So I can comfortably rest it, and it gives me a stability without having to rest my hand on the drawing. And of course, maul sticks are intended really for painting because you can imagine the painting as a wet surface. And we don't want to rest our hand on the wet surface and smear our paint. But really for this kind of controlled modeling and rendering of any kind of drawing, graphite, charcoal, chalk, we should really use a maul stick if it's going to help us. So here I'm preparing the area where I would like to use the white chalk. Now, let me bring up something, which is you might notice that actually looks pretty great when you have a thin charcoal residue and you cut through it with the eraser. You notice that you can sculpt with the eraser. You can create fine transitions of tone with the eraser. And it's completely valid. I just want you to know this in advance. It's completely valid that if you do something with the eraser and it achieves the correct value that you're looking for, it is a valid endpoint to the rendering. So be prepared that there may be things that you do with your eraser subtractively that are actually valid rendering techniques in of themselves. So sometimes you do something with the eraser and that's the end. That's how it's going to look. But I want to go to a brighter value here. So I've sort of prepared the zone by removing the remainder of the vine charcoal from before. And now we're going to come in with the white chalk. Now you notice I'm kind of hatching. I'm putting down lines off the tip of the pencil, one at a time, tightly knit together. And when we hatch, we're thinking about putting cross contours on a form that have sculptural meanings. So they're really, the thinking is that I'm doing cross contours, multitudes of cross contours. And I can do them in any direction that I want as long as they are consistent with the explanation of the form, the turning of the form. So if you can draw a cross contour around the form this way, you can do hatches that way. If you could do a cross contour around a form that's this way, you could do hatches that way. Any direction that you can conceive of, and if you're in the mindset of understanding how the lines would transcribe themselves over the topography of the form. And that's what these are. They're topographical lines. So anything that makes sense to you as a topographical analysis of the form in the direction that you want to lay down the hatching is a valid direction. So as I come over here, I'm feeling the form wants to go this way. So it's very sculptural. We're in the mindset of sculpture. One of the best ways you can study hatching is to look at Michelangelo's drawings and his sculptures together as a study. And in particular, look at his unfinished sculptures, his unfinished marble sculptures, because he used, as any stone sculptor would, he uses a point, a rake, and a flat chisel. So in the middle of the process, the rake is a chisel with teeth on it. And in Michelangelo's unfinished sculptures, he leaves teeth marks across the sculpture. So they literally leave striations in the form on the stone. And you can see that he's thinking about how those lines that he leaves would reinforce the sculptural properties of the form he's trying to create in stone. And then you see the exact same language play out in his drawings as well. So it's really an enriching activity to take a look at the unfinished sculptures by Michelangelo, his Dying Slave series, his lesser-known Pietà in the Duomo in Florence, unfinished. There's sections of the figures from the Medici Chapel, the Medici tomb, where there are night and day and twilight and dawn figures where areas of them are unfinished. You'll see striations in the forms where he didn't polish the marble. And that's the secret to cross-hatching in your drawings, is looking and studying those lines. Now this is a very this happens a lot. I'm gonna end with this here, but now that I've put white charcoal here, white chalk here and here, and I have a dark light in between them, the value looks too dark now. So I've overcut the form. So it's very natural to have to go back and remove some of this to go back to the paper there and make it more subtle. And that's very common. That's going to happen to you, I guarantee it. At first, you're going to think you need to put some charcoal down in a place like that, or a place like this, or maybe a place like that. If you look at the image of John, the videos and photos, any place a little dark light occurs, it might seem at first that you need to put some charcoal there. But then you'll surround it with white chalk on either side. And then you'll see, in fact, it was too dark, and what really should have been there is the paper. So it's a wonderful lesson in value, using the paper and the white chalk. So I'm turning the form as I'm going, one form goal at a time. I'm not going to now jump over here or skip down to here. I'm not going to render anything which isn't immediately attached and adjacent to this area. And you know where I'm going. I'm going to do the nose next. But I'm going to do that because it attaches to this. And as I render the nose, I'm going to consider how can I integrate the nose into what's already done, and then render them together as a team. So this is called making a form pass over the drawing. And we're going to go one form pass at a time. And we try to render each area to completion as best as we can before we move on to the next area. And that's how we can control our value relationships, and that's how we can derive the most accurate value relationships. All right, thanks very much. I look forward to seeing your progress on your rendering.